It is 7/29 of 2015. We're going to take a look at Brentano's 1915 essay on measure of magnitude. I'm transcribed by his wife Emily because Brentano was completely blind in 1915. He begins with the what he calls a twofold presentation of the primary object. The primary continuum contains the continuity of temporal differences and the successive differences of place. And it leads to a compensation because each of the different topoids in their interrelatedness become involved in a compensation of their own singular spatial teleosis, because any other part of the model will in some sense limit their singular teleosis. So there's some compensation. Now, actual magnitude equals spatial length for Brentano of the primary continuum, and curved space simply means that space is involved in more than one dimension. But every one of these singular spatial teleoses is enclosed in an overall teleosis of the primary continuum. So each of the singular species of genera, or each topoid, is moving toward its own full singular teleosis, which includes the filling of that content, pleirosis, to a mature content, and the development of its own singular temporal directedness within that secondary temporal continuum. So it's just pointing out here that within the first primary continuum of space, or of place, we should say, that the individual topoids are involved in their own individual teleosis. They do have an individual teleosis to fulfill as well. And therefore, in a way, they cooperate with the overall system of teleosis, but they also kind of compete with each other. They kind of limit each other's individual teleosis. On the second moment of the cyclical, in this essay, Brentano gives us the preparatory steps before forming a sign model. And the first preparatory step is to call up our motivational base. He calls that a cyclical motivational base. It's an inward presentation of mind, or the cyclical, and it encloses our past habits, and it encloses our past intuitive beliefs, beliefs that have been refined to intuitive belief. They are beliefs that have been worked out through dialectic, but then once we return them to the motivational base, they are posited and recorded as intuitive, as part of our motivation. And it is fueled by the return of posited sign models, and it does become, for Brentano, a recalled or a called up cyclical present object. It becomes a present object of presentation to the mind, and it's going to assist us in lifting our topoids to signification. Now, the second preparatory step is going to involve inference and positing. We've already discussed positing, of that temporary positing of the temporal continuum, but we take up the work of noticing the relevant mark of signification. And we make that temporary positing of the temporal continuum, but that allows us to just grasp the mark, which is the sign's premise. The relevant mark equals the sign's premise. But once we have the sign's premise for each topoid, then we get involved in temporal inference, and we can transition from premise to sign's completeness. We can look at the entire temporal direction of the sign, and in that way we can define the sign with an abstract name. So relevant mark equals sign's premise in this essay. We grasp the sign's premise through noticing, and then we can infer the full trajectory of the sign and actually give it an abstract sign name. When we get to the moment of sign modeling, we enlist internal dialectic and spatial imprinting says Brentano, in order to form the abstracto sign genus, or the sign model. We internally grasp ourselves as real substance. We always internally posit analytic judgments to our stored spatial positions in our long-term memory. This is the first time that Brentano has brought up long-term memory, but our long-term memory stores our long-term memory model of substance as a reference point. It becomes in a way our reference point of universality. So we do have a long-term memory which does store that substantial aspect of universality. And this is the experience that confronts secondary presentation. It is our existential and analytic experience stored as a model of substance of universality and our long-term memory. But we also have stored in our memory that topoid model of place from the first moment, and so we can use it also as a written sign. It becomes a sign to assist us in forming our abstracto sign model. So really we end up with a 4-part contribution to forming a relational sign model. Our motivational base, our noticing through the positing of temporal continuum, our experience, existential and analytic, of long-term memory, and the place model from the first moment as a signification to assist in forming the model. So it's a 4-fold contribution that actually does become enlisted in the formation of that abstracto sign genus sign model that encloses all of our topoids that have been lifted to signification, our topoid signs in their proper place. So it becomes, in a way, it becomes a way of forming a model through imprinting, because we don't abandon our previous work. We call up that previous spatial model of topoids, and we recall motivational base, which gives us kind of a certainty. Remember, we posit models of probability, but our motivation always carries a conviction of certainty. We always feel certain about our motivation. And then in our long-term memory, that's where we store that sui generis model of universality. It gets stored bit by bit into long-term memory and becomes a long-term memory model of substance, of the substance of the real, the substance of the true. And that becomes a referential point for us. It becomes experience. In a way, it is the model of experience that we've categorized as universal, which we gained bit by bit in the realm of spirit, which for Brentano is Aristotle's De Kunta threshold. Remember, Brentano really centers on Aristotle's De Kunta threshold, and that is where we really begin to form, bit by bit, that universality of our long-term memory. So it's a different approach in this essay, but it gives us a little more data on continuum, and that puts us up through page 78.